Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, our very proud lecturers, and our fellow colleagues, as well as our undergrad students that I see here. I will be presenting my topic on contractor management of refurbishment characteristics. I really think this is a very interesting title and topic, so I hope to grasp your 15 minutes of your time before we adjourn for lunch. On my agenda, I will be presenting, or I will indicate my introduction by stating what refurbishment is, as well as the common ground. And then I will, for the next part, I will be discussing my literature review, which will indicate a very interesting refurbishment like characteristics. And then I will follow to my research methodology, what I have used, as well as then a very important section of my study, the findings, and then some relevant conclusions and some valuable recommendations. And then I will, then some answers and questions will be asked. In my introduction, refurbishment is a process of improvement, alteration, and adaptation which are carried out on an existing building for a variety of reasons. Now I will break this definition up into improvement is when you get the building and its facilities up to acceptable standard. And then alterations is then inevitably to change the existing structure of the building. And then adaptation is to accommodate for the building, to accommodate the change of the building use. Refurbishment potentially contain more technical and economical uncertainties than new build projects. These uncertainties and risks involved in these projects has brought up some numerous refurbishment characteristics that cause implications in the management process thereof, and then it leads to project time and cost overruns. This research aimed to identify the major characteristics and difficulties which confront construction professionals in carrying out refurbishment work. Firstly, to identify those characteristics which are difficult to manage, and secondly, those characteristics which are managed a great deal during refurbishment work. I'll be now moving on to my literature review, starting with management in refurbishment. It is important to have persons with specialized skills and experience involved with refurbishment projects. You must also have a specialized risk manager with knowledge in refurbishment who must analyze the information about the existing building, its costs and designs. It is debatable and argued by previous researchers that refurbishment potentially can have up to 50% more complications than new build projects. These refurbishment processes demand greater attention and supervision than general construction management. We're now moving on to managing refurbishment projects in occupied buildings. The future of refurbishment projects will demand contractors to refurbish buildings while it remains occupied. The influence of occupants during the progress of the works will definitely cause disruptions. Due to the fact that, and it makes the management challenging as construction crews and tenants occupy the same space. We're now moving on to the difficulties in pricing for refurbishment work. Firstly, the health and safety. It's before the project starts, it's very hard to price health and safety. Secondly, the presence of lead and asbestos. When it hasn't been indicated on the drawings that lead and asbestos were present, it could lead to very much increased costs, as you need a specialized contractor to remove these dangerous materials. And then the protection of surrounding areas, as well as areas. Before work commences, it is very difficult to price the protection of areas which will be protected during construction. And then demolition restrictions. Normally in refurbishment, demolitions will require to take place. And then there should be provision made for noise and noise control and dust control. Now I will be focusing on managing refurbishment disruptions. Firstly, noise. Noise could be controlled by the use of effective sound barriers, as well as restricting the work to hours when the occupants are not affected. Next is dust. Dust could be controlled by the use of effective dust screens, as well as effective ventilation systems. Next we have fumes. Fumes could be controlled by the use of effective extraction systems. And the last, but not to be ignored, dirt. Dirt could be simply removed by cleaning workable areas as thorough as possible. Now I'll be showing the areas which risks could be involved during refurbishment work. Firstly, the lack of information regarding the existing status of the building. Secondly, the ease of access of that existing building. And then as well as the type and nature of buildings to refurbish, such as historical buildings, office or refurbishment, industrial, etc. And then the health and safety issues, as there should be more temporary works like scaffolding and shoring works. I'll be now moving on to the research methodology, and I stated that I used the quantitative research methodology, whereby questionnaires were administered in the form of online surveys as well as handout questionnaires to increase my response rate. These questionnaires were distributed to the contractors in the Eastern Cape using stratified random sampling, where my sample was in the Eastern Cape, so I divided those contractors in their tender groups, which the maximum tender categories they could tender for. The lowest category were between 500 and 650,000, and the largest were from 130 million to no limit. And from those, I picked random contractors. The contractors that indicated and gave me feedback that they were not involved with refurbishment, they were ultimately removed from the sample, as this study only pertains to refurbishment work. I'll be now moving on to my findings. I received 21 responses from my online survey, and then an additional 13 responses from my handout questionnaires, which ultimately gave me an overall of 34 responses. And the 34 responses gave me an overall response rate of 21%, and I asked 165 contractors in my sample. I'll be now moving on to my demographic findings. Starting with all the respondents' organizations that were asked to participate in this study were actually involved with refurbishment, and in the following type: office refurbishment, school and college, industrial, residential, historical, shopping complex and hospital, and then other. It is important to notice that office, school and industrial were the refurbishment category that the most respondents were involved with, which indicates that it could state that the office and the school or college refurbishment were refurbished while it was partially occupied. We're now moving on to refurbishment versus new build. I asked the respondents their perception of if the managing of refurbishment is more difficult than the management of new build. It was answered that refurbishment is more difficult. 88% of the respondents indicated that, and only 12% indicated that it was not more difficult than that refurbishment is not more difficult than new build. I'll be now moving on to the identified refurbishment characteristics I identified in my study. I challenged the audience to just look at the identified characteristics and think by yourself which one do you think would be the most difficult to manage. That's what my objectives were. Okay, so let's move on. So my findings. The top 5 most difficult refurbishment characteristics to manage. I will start from the bottom with dust control, which also related back in my literature that it will cause disruptions, as well as restriction in plant usage, noise control, cost control, and then the most difficult refurbishment characteristics that were indicated by the respondents is the influence that the occupants have on the progress of the works. It's also stated in my literature that it will have influence on the progress of the works. As I will give a small example, at NMMU they're busy refurbishing there in the dance den. They're doing a bitumen lab, And I know that a lot of lecturers and students get very irritated with these works on site, and sometimes will pull out their leads with if there was a drill or so, you know, and yeah. And then my next part was to find out which are the top 5 most frequent refurbishment characteristics to manage. I will start from the bottom. It was the programming and scheduling of the works, maintaining site safety and welfare standards, then pricing of the works, and then noise control was a big deal, and it was managed 83%. That was the degree of frequency of managing that. And then the most frequent refurbishment characteristic to manage were cost control, as the contractors perceived that they can't go over the client's budget, and they needed to end the project within the budget. So they thought that cost control was the most frequent to manage on site. And now, lastly, I made an integration between the most difficult and the most frequent refurbishment characteristic. And I came up with the conclusion that dust control was the top 5 of the 37 I identified, and then restriction in plant usage, the influence that the occupants have on the progress of the works, and then noise control, and then cost control. I will now give the audience some conclusions that I made throughout my whole study. Firstly, that managing refurbishment is definitely more difficult than managing new build projects. There are refurbishment characteristics that are difficult to manage, such as the influence that the occupants have on the progress of the work. I also identified that there are refurbishment characteristics that are managed a great deal during refurbishment, such as cost control that needs in-depth and everyday management. And then lastly, for my conclusion, there appears to be a relationship between refurbishment characteristics that are difficult and frequently managed. I will now give some valuable recommendations that I made after my study. The identification of these major characteristics has made it possible for guidelines to be developed to overcome these difficulties and implications. Appointment of a tenant liaison officer or facilities manager in the design stage as well as the construction stage of refurbishment projects can successfully coordinate construction work in occupied buildings, such as set up a renovation schedule to indicate when the occupants have their activities and when the construction crews have their activities, so that they don't work on the same time. And then quantity surveyors, who are regarded as cost experts in construction, have the opportunity to extensively use their cost knowledge and skills to improve cost control during refurbishment projects, as this was one of the top 5 difficult refurbishment characteristics to manage, as well it was actually the most frequently managed. And then my last recommendation, the management education and training in context to refurbishment work should be implemented in any built environment curriculum. I say thank you for this opportunity to share my topic with you, and now we'll be opening the field for question and answers.
Thanks, Tiaan, for that interesting topic. Just one thing, I think we're all quantity surveyors, and as you said, keyword is cost. In your research, did you actually look at the indication, what is the increase in cost comparing a normal new building to a refurbishment?
I only saw that that the contingencies needed it's say for normal new build was between 5 and 10, and then for refurbishment it was actually from 5 to 15% that you could give a contingency for to cover for those uncertainties and risks that could involve later in the project as the work commenced, because you don't know everything before the work started. Yeah, and I only identified characteristics. I didn't have any big long questions. It was just the frequency of the difficulty of managing those and the frequency of managing those 37 I identified.
Sharon?
Thank you.
Anita? I think it's a very interesting topic and very relevant, especially to me with my little bit of experience. We have big problems with cost control wherever there's refurbishment projects. And I think just one thing that you must also consider is the timeline of the project when it comes to refurbishment or renovations. The longer the timeline, the more unforeseen issues appear. So it's just a common thing.
Thank you.
I can only tell you what Anton Rousseau said to me once when we were talking about refurbishment, and he's one of the most senior QSs in Port Elizabeth. He said to me, there's only one solution to an estimate for refurbishment. Think of a figure and double it.
Yes.
But I think it goes further than that. Think of a figure and treble it. And as you have design risk diminishing, so you have price risk diminishing until you come down to reasonable occupational specifications and material specifications, and then you still have to have, in my view, a higher value for contingencies than you would have anywhere else. So we still come down to Anton's recommendation. Think of a figure and double it, right up to the end.
I agree.
What do you say?
Anybody else? Thank you very much.